But somehow, like, this type of art has gotten the attention of a lot of people who weren't otherwise interested in art or like having a digital collection of like images. Somehow it got new blood into the mix of like collecting.
I'm Kate Brown, and this is The Art Angle, a podcast from ArtNet News. My colleague Annie Armstrong honed in on a new phenomenon in the art world recently, in all its chaotic glory. She's calling it red chip art. It's the strange cousin of blue chip art, and it's shiny, chrome-dipped, algorithmically boosted, and increasingly popular. According to Annie's recent essay, the archetype buyer of this kind of art is a man in a Cybertruck checking his crypto wallet and queuing up a Joe Rogan episode while speeding towards an art opening. Maybe it's an Alec Monopoly show or a mischief drop. Red chip art is, according to Annie, an aesthetic vibe and sensibility. And she joins me on the Art Angle to talk about the mood of this category, defining its lineage of fans, from crypto bros to Kanye West, its canonical works from KAWS' Companions to Daniel Arsham's sculptures of Mark Zuckerberg's wife in Tiffany blue. Annie also notes that red chip art is also not related to Trumpism. Hey, Annie, how's it going today?
I'm so good. How are you, Kate?
I'm good. It was a great pleasure to reread this excellent piece that you wrote. It's so colorful. There's so much to get into. So I'm excited to talk to you today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm happy to talk about it.
Yeah, let's get into red chip art. So this is like a term that has somewhat been floating around, but I think you really bring a definition to it that many people have wanted. Do you remember when you first heard it and what was going on in the art world at the time when it cropped up?
I mentioned pretty early on in the piece that my original understanding of what red chip art was a misunderstanding. I heard it for the first time after I went to Art Basel in Switzerland for the first time in 2022. And that was kind of at the very end of the post-pandemic boom where a bunch of ultra-contemporary artists were exploding. A lot of people were selling new pieces of art like hotcakes. And I think that it was a blanket term used for artists if they were born after 1975. I think an advisor maybe said it to me. And it was used derogatorily. It was definitely used to reference a bubble in the art market. And I don't think it really got much press after that summer or at all, really. And I just clung on to it. And as you know from being on the ArtNet team, I've been thinking about this concept for a long time and only recently finally got to write about it. Finally was able to end my thesis or find the full scope of it.
For sure. And you did a very full color job of defining this and storytelling it. It was a pleasure to read. And I think also starting with this misunderstanding and then forming your own definition of it, which is in a way somehow different from this pre-existing definition, which is probably dead since your article came out. So you're speaking about a different kind of hype cycle in your definition, one that's more about editions and online frenzies that's stemming not from maybe within the art world, but from within the collectible world. But as we'll talk about, it's not like a one-way flow. These are flowing back and forth. Yeah, we'll get into that in a bit, but let's start with some examples of so-called red chip art so you can really illustrate what you mean for listeners.
I think the best examples are probably the most popular ones, which would be a KAWS figurine. The KAWS Companions, there's huge ones that he puts out in the Hong Kong harbor. And then there's the tiny collectible ones that I know a lot of collectors who have said that they started their art collecting practice with collecting these tiny KAWS figurines. You can get them at whatever price point. They can be in the millions and they can also be in, I don't know how much the little ones sell for, but I assume at least maybe under $10,000. I'm not sure. So I think that that's one example of it because I think something that is a positive maybe about red chip art, as I put it, is that it's pretty democratic. There's kind of something for everyone at every price point. But then there's the super high-end examples like Beeple's 5,000 Days, which I think was the start of a different moment in this aesthetics journey. KAWS has been making the companion pieces for a while, but the rise of NFTs and NFTs being considered art at all, I think is really when this became a different movement.
And that's so much informed by the people who had money to spend that it became this kind of viable art form in a way. Could you unpack a bit more what you mean by these aesthetic parameters of what red chip art is?
Yeah, I feel if I go on a crawl in Chelsea, I'll always see something that has this super flat, kind of cartoonish, mega colorful, eye-grabbing aesthetic. Maybe there's chrome, maybe there's a cartoon figure in it. There's a street art aesthetic to it sometimes. Other times it's just meant to look like a toy. Yeah, I think that that's how I'll put it. And I see it in a lot of different artist practices too. It's not totally just limited to a set of artists. I think it's also a type of aesthetic in art.
Yeah, it struck me when I was reading it that it's a sort of art form that is not afraid of attaching itself to consumerism, which I feel like a lot of artists pretend that they're not attached to consumerism, even though they certainly are. I mean, when we're talking about red chip art, it's a definition that's set against so-called blue chip art, which I was thinking about it as I was reading your article, and I was like, is there like a definition of blue chip art, or is it more like of a vibe?
Well, before this, I looked up the definition of blue chip art as it is online, just blue chip in general, like anything that's blue chip, which obviously applies to a lot of different luxury products. And on Google, there are two definitions. One is it denotes companies or their shares that are considered to be a reliable investment. And the other definition of blue chip is of the highest quality. So I think blue chip art is definitely in between. Those are interwoven where it's high quality art that is a sound investment. And I guess the difference between blue chip and red chip per that parameter is I don't think quality is really necessarily at play in red chip art. And I don't think it's necessarily a sound investment. It might be like a very quickly satisfying investment, but I don't think it's meant to be a long-term at all. It's a churn and burn sort of environment.
Right, like a pump and dump. There's a little more risk associated with it, perhaps.
Yeah.
In your piece, you also talk about native red chip art versus like a more transitional figure of a red chip artist who kind of moves between the worlds of maybe the blue chip art world and the red chip art world. Can you describe these figures a little bit more?
Yeah, I point out that Takashi Murakami and Jeff Koons are the transitional figures between blue chip art and red chip art, joking that they're purple chip art. I think that they are true artists where their practice began with a lot of reverence for art history. They started far more conceptual than where they've ended up now. But somewhere along their artistic journey, they came to this conclusion of hyper-commercialized art, or I guess like repeating all these aesthetic tropes that have come to define how we see them now. But regardless of that, they have a foundation that is very conceptual and has a place in an art history book, whereas the native red chippers, I don't really ever see breaking into that mold. It's almost more decorative art.
It's so interesting because like Takashi Murakami and Jeff Koons, or maybe Alex Israel, when they do these kinds of red chip art moments, you know, ultimately like maybe collab with a luxury car brand or have some sort of public moment like that, they can do it under the auspices of it being like related to pop art. Mm-hmm. So they kind of are able to continue to sort of pull at art history, but it's tenuous, isn't it?
It's tenuous, and I think that maybe a big difference too between what I would define as red chip art and blue chip art is the relationship between artist and collector. Like I think that any traditional art world artist who like has their artwork flipped really quickly is going to be pissed about it, or is going to be against whatever art market setup that makes it such that a collector can do that. But then a red chip artist is anticipating that their value is going to be like driven up to this wild point. They want it to go as high as it possibly can. They don't necessarily even need to see any returns from it. It's like all the stock gamified version of their output. It reminds me of like the Joker, like burning that big thing of cash and being like, ha ha ha. And, you know, the Joker is like, his face appears a lot in red chip art. It makes sense that they like him.
For sure. Well, there's like definitely like some goofiness involved. And as you say, like new money's at play. And a lot of this is about flaunting wealth, which is like not to say that a lot of art collecting isn't about flaunting wealth. It's just like done in a different way, perhaps. Like I was even just thinking about the fact that crypto wallets are public. Like you might not be able to see the person's name, but you can see everything they own. There's like a more of like a flaunting quality to things. Like maybe we could talk a bit about red chip art buyers and what this kind of personality tends to be. You also mentioned to me off air something that was really interesting. You kind of draw an analogy to like architecture and how that relates to value.
I guess it's just like two different type of consumers, maybe, where federal banks were made for the longest time in this neoclassical structure. And it was made to like evoke, like, we've been around since the Roman Empire. Like you can really trust that your money is in good hands, like historically protected because of the duration of humanity. And then there's the other type of consumer that eschews this historicized trust in federal wealth and then decided that all money should be decentralized and put on the blockchain, which is just taking money into our own hands and not trusting the government whatsoever. So I think that that shift in like where you see faith in money and faith in longevity, like it's analogous to how you see the value of your art. I think that a lot of blue chip art is historical because it's just agreed upon that the consensus of art history says that, yes, you want to buy this giant Joan Mitchell painting because we've agreed that this is good art. And then there's this other type of art consumer now that says, no, 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 no. What I think is good art has nothing to do with the establishment. We're going to reimagine the rules entirely. So there's kind of like a refreshing rebelliousness to the core of red chip art. I just wish it was cooler. Like, I just wish I liked how it looked better.
Yeah, because when you say it like that, it is rebellious.
It's kind of renegade.
It's totally exciting. And it matches an era that we're in where like we're just feeling like this tectonic shift and we don't know what's next. But it's there's something, and I think you get to this in your piece, that there's like a lack of experimentation. And that's because there is this sort of hype cycle of just selling editions and this kind of thing that maybe doesn't beget a person to maybe sit in a studio for a while and really like ponder what their comment is, perhaps.
Yeah, it's totally formulaic. There's not much there in terms of concept. So I like admire the framework, but I definitely am not a fan of the product.
Mm-hmm.
But that's me. I think that there's a lot of people who really see this as the next iteration of pop art. And I think that there's a big argument to be made that the new world order under tech oligarchs, this is what art is when Elon Musk is in the White House for however long he's going to remain in the White House. The fact that he's been there at all, like, I think that to whatever extent art is a reflection of society, what we see is what we get.
Yeah. And I mean, artists like people have been absorbed into the institutional framework. I think the blue chip artists are defined as such by a whole kind of canon that supports them, like the art critics, the newspapers and magazines and broadsheets and legacy media that like create a narrative. And I think that that is all broken away. So then you have this kind of, for lack of a better word, like Wild West, where it's like X threads and DMs. And that's what's kind of creating the discourse around this stuff.
It's super online. I think I kind of say in the essay what I think is the farthest end of red chip, which is probably Jeff Koons and Takashi Murakami, even though they're like kind of founding. They really aren't red chip. But then I was thinking about like what's on the other side. I thought of Thomas Hirschhorn's show at Barbara Gladstone this past year, which is sort of like analog red chip art. It has the look of what Ben Davis has coined the cursed vibe of AI slop. But he does it in a way that's just truly analog. I don't think there's any tech component to it. It's truly just an installation. So I feel like in the traditional art world, there is a way that we've addressed this vibe shift or this new guard of aesthetics.
Yeah, it's almost like we just haven't been adapting fast enough, one could say. It's interesting that the pressures of money will move things forward. And I think that maybe that's a good segue to talk about the intelligence report, which came out in March. There were some interesting data points in there, like millennials and Gen Zers accounted for a quarter to a third of bidders and buyers at two major auction houses in 2024. So they more than doubled their share in 5 years. So there's this big wealth transfer happening where millennials are going to inherit something like 27 trillion and Gen Z is going to inherit 11 trillion. So in this fold, we're seeing more cross-category sales at auction. And I wondered if you could talk a bit about that. Like, is this red chip art the same that you're seeing appear at auction more and more? And are the auction houses also responding to this demand and trying to like get it into the fold of their quote unquote programming?
I feel like as far as the institutions like old school art world reporters, non-red chip people reporters know, the auction houses I think have embraced this the most, which makes a lot of sense given Katya's findings. I pause a little bit in associating red chip too much with millennial and Gen Z collectors because, like I said, like I do know a lot of collectors whose collecting habits have moved past KAWS, but like started there. It makes a lot of sense to assume that this is the youth guard, but I think this has been around for a longer time. And it reminds me of the joke that like everybody says that there's iPad kids, but then everybody has an iPad uncle. Like I think that is kind of true to people that are attracted to this mentality of collecting. I don't think it's necessarily tethered to age, but obviously, as I mentioned in the essay, Gen Z buying habits and buying a bunch of Shein to just throw it away is inevitably tied to red chip art. I don't know if I answered your question.
Yeah, for sure. And I guess I was thinking just because there is such a strong online component, I assumed maybe it would be a younger cohort. But then also, yeah, like your uncle is on Facebook and poking around. So it knows no bounds of age, perhaps.
Yeah, when I was writing this essay, I tried to like fit it in. Did you see Anora?
Yes.
Okay, so the Russian kid in it, like her husband, He is like the ultimate red chip collector to me. His wealth is mysterious. He just wants to smoke weed all day and like play video games. And he totally would have a bear brick in the corner of his room and just like buy it without really knowing what it is. But he wants to be part of the club. He is like the ultimate red chip collector in my mind. So there's also definitely like the trope of the young, mysteriously rich millennial / young millennial / old Gen Z.
That are having a great time till their parents come and like reel them in.
Exactly, yeah.
You say in your piece that it's not unrelated to Trump aesthetics. And on the surface, at least, it's sort of apolitical. And I'm wondering about this because you also linked to this article from New Yorker staff writer Kyle Shakeup about this AI propaganda video that Trump reshared earlier this year. You know, the one with him and Bibi sipping cocktails in Gaza with Trump hotels, which is very heavily political piece of propaganda. So I'm wondering, like, can you unpack what the takeaway is here? Are red chip art people red-pilled, or are they just trolling the aesthetic? What's your kind of feeling around that?
I think that was maybe the most contentious point in the piece is when you have to address whether it's a political leaning, because as we know, lots of red-pilled people are buying Joan Mitchell paintings and not just discriminating to KAWS. But I don't think that it necessarily has to do anything with your political beliefs. But I think how red chip art looks is the runoff of having somebody like Trump in office and having that mentality become more mainstream and not on the fringes. I think that that's what we get for centering that type of ideology, which is why it's inevitably political, but it also is just a side effect of the time. But then it's also, like, I'm thinking about it too, Beeple is pretty political no matter what. But then, like, when you really think about the native red chip art, like Alec Monopoly, it literally has nothing to do with politics.
It's a good point. I mean, I think also maybe my understanding of it is that it's an aesthetic-led sensibility that maybe has secondary effects on politics because it sort of like normalizes a certain aesthetic and conversation. And I think, you know, you bring up the Trump voter who buys Joan Mitchell. I think that there are a lot of people that are very, very conservative in the blue chip art world. They just are expressing themselves differently.
Yeah, that's totally what I mean. And I just think it is political because it could probably only ever get this popular with somebody like Trump as the most famous man in the world, maybe one of the most famous men in the world.
No, we'll give him most famous right now. He's really dominating the headlines.
Most famous world. Yeah, I think that like it could only get this popular when something like that is going on. This would never happen in the Obama era.
So just to push back a bit and play the devil's advocate, what would you say is actually the difference between red chip art and, say, an art flipper? And like a person, you know, who pumps and dumps young artists. And I know this whole category is waning a bit in these like turbulent economic times that we've talked about a lot on the podcast and on ArtNet News. But I'm still curious, like there was a lot of chatter about these male-dominated WhatsApp groups and these Gmail art advisors where people were bragging about flipping an Adrian Genny, or more recently, like scooping cheap art that belonged to Lisa Schiff and scrolling on their phones and looking at the hot emerging painters that they got good deals on and what their prices are now. Like there's some real Wall Street bets energy to that, even if it maybe is like Yale educated or something. And maybe these people have family collections. How do you delineate those two things?
I think that red chip art is intended to be flipped versus Adrian Genny, Lucy Bull. Like, I think both of them have spoken up about how dismaying it is when their artwork gets flipped. I think people in the red chip sphere are very okay with it, / would even go to the auction where their artwork is getting flipped and smile with the collector who did it. So it's just a new model. And I also kind of think that those like bro group chats, I bet like half of them are into this stuff too. I don't think they're delineated really. Like, I think they're probably like one and the same. I think the really savvy ones are getting their toes in both pools of flipping more traditional art and then flipping their Bored Ape, Yacht Club, Ape, whatever they're called. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. In a way, it's like a more honest world, you know, where like there's a real synchronicity between what's being created and how it's circulating, that everyone's kind of bought in and into it. Whereas I do think it's an important point that you bring up that like artists like Lucy Bull, who, you know, like in spite of herself, the market just bloomed out of control and that wasn't like her intention.
Yeah. I kind of think that that maybe is another way that this delineation mirrors something political, which is that blue chip art, it's a pretty unauthentic market where people are sneaky and go above each other's heads and act out of favor of the artist and whatever. And then red chip art, maybe it's a little bit more evil and it's a little bit more cheap, but at least it's authentic. Like, you know exactly what you're going to get out of it.
Yeah.
If you start to play with these people, or if you start to play with these concepts, your art's going to get flipped, but maybe that means down the road that somebody else is going to commission you higher, or whatever it is, for an artist to have their market driven up so high and not really see any of the returns. It's the Joker ideology.
It makes me think of like what David Foster Wallace said about Vegas. It's like, Vegas is the best place in the world because it doesn't pretend to be anything other than what it is.
Exactly.
And it's this.
Yeah. It's not cloaked in any like, we just like love the artwork so much, but you know, in 6 months it's going to go to Phillips.
Yeah. And there is something really unsettling about that, which I think we should talk about more in general, is there is like a real inauthenticity sometimes to the conversations that we have, where people do pretend that there is a longevity to some of these conversations when really like there is a bit of like a hype cycle that is just being stylized differently.
Yeah. There's like a ton of duplicity in the traditional art world that I think maybe, I don't know, could stand to learn a thing or two from red chip art collectors.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it brings up a good point where, you know, your piece is not, well, there's some criticism in there for sure, but as you said, it shouldn't be read fully as derogatory.
No.
You may not think that it's cool, but the characteristics of it, there is something to learn there.
Yeah, I mean, like personally, the way that it mirrors in my life as a non-art collector, it reminds me of how I shop versus how I see a lot of other people my age shop. I really want good vintage. I'll like pay for like some silver tab Levi's because they were made at a time when like pants were made with higher quality. And then it's like, I feel like such a Luddite or like so behind the times because it's like, I could just get similar looking pants on Shein or like Temu or whatever for a third the price. It's just two different like consumer mentalities.
And also one falls apart in 6 months.
Yeah, exactly.
You close out with an interesting point. You say, red chip art may not need the traditional art world to keep growing, but I'm not confident that the reverse is true. I thought this was a really interesting idea. Could you unpack it a bit? Because you note in the piece that the traditional art world, by which we mean, you know, these storied brick and mortar institutions, the curators that inhabit them, and the echelons of dealers who have these massive spaces all over the world, they've struggled to capture this newly wealthy, sometimes tech elite who often like this kind of stuff.
I think one of the most interesting conversations I've had about the down market was over the summer with an art dealer who was just saying it's really the gallery world's fault for not being able to get the interest of younger collectors. It's really our fault for like relying on this class of collectors who are getting much older and won't be around for that much longer to prop up the industry. But somehow like this type of art has gotten the attention of a lot of people who weren't otherwise interested in art or like having a digital collection of like images. Somehow it got new blood into the mix of like collecting. And our traditional art world really has struggled very, very hard to do that. So I just wonder, while museums are announcing so many layoffs, while galleries continue to close, where is the nucleus of attention going to start to go? Our art world might start to seem more fringe in like maybe 10, 15 years once this older generation of collectors with their older generation collecting habits dies. So we'll see.
Yeah. And it'll seem more fringe in totally different spaces maybe, because so much of this new art world is completely online. And also the way that we experience it is totally different. So it'll be interesting to see how it evolves.
It could be a really good thing because another dealer I was just talking about this recently with, he works in like a traditional art gallery that's sort of like mid-tier. And he was just saying like, if I had this job selling art in the 80s, 90s, I could sell to my peers who are also in their 30s, like kind of at the beginning of their career. But now when the price point starts so high, I can't sell to my peers. I have to sell to people much older than me to get people to start in. So like maybe if the nucleus does shift away from emerging art can become affordable again and get some attention from younger collectors. I could see it. That's how the pendulum starts to swing. Who knows? But just thinking about it.
Totally. And in the meantime, there's a lot of experimentation that can happen while the art world, our art world, so to speak, tries to figure out what it's going to do next.
Yeah, definitely.
So, I do have one last question that I'm going to close out with, which is, if you could have one piece of red chip art, what would it be?
Okay, great question. The most expensive one. I would have Beeple's 5,000 Days, and I would sell it immediately.
Nice.
Yeah.
Okay. I think I would have like Perrotin's boots, but the ones that he wore, and then I could sell
Good
them
provenance. Yeah, that's good provenance.
Yeah.
You would look cool in those, Kate. I think you could pull them off.
I would try at least one. Well, thanks so much for coming on The Art Angle. It was a pleasure.
Thank you so much for having me, Kate.
That's it for this week's episode. If you like what you heard, you can subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you get your podcasts. Also, take a moment to rate and review us. It will help other listeners discover what we're doing. The Art Angle is produced by Sonia Manalili, with contributions from Kate Brown, Ben Davis, Carolyn Goldstein, and Naomi Ray. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week.